Next presenter is Robyn Wilson from OSU. She's going to talk to us about BMPs and the efficacy gap. Robyn?
All right, well, thanks for having me. We're going to switch gears a little bit. So we've spent over a day hearing about the latest and greatest really physical science around this issue and trying to better understand what sorts of practices should work, what can we recommend, what are the kind of system level dynamics that are happening on farms and at the field level. And we're going to now talk social science. So it's a pretty big shift, but hopefully this will be helpful in kind of thinking about problem solving related to these issues and how we take the recommendations coming out of a lot of the research we've been hearing about and actually make sure they get implemented. And so that's a lot of what I think about. I'm a behavioral decision scientist in the School of Environment and Natural Resources at Ohio State. And a lot of what I do is try to understand why people make the choices that they make, what sorts of factors, whether they're psychological factors or social factors or economic factors, what sorts of things are playing into those decisions. And then if we understand that better, how can we design policy to be more effective? How can we design our outreach efforts to be more effective so that we can increase motivation to engage in the sorts of things that we're trying to recommend? So that's at kind of a big level what I think about. I've been involved in farmer decision-making related to nutrient loss for probably 6 or 7 years now, so for quite a while. So I'm going to highlight kind of broadly what the goals of that research are and then go through some kind of specific findings from a survey that we did. I guess it was ongoing this time last year, so it wrapped up last spring. And just kind of highlight some of the work that we're doing about trying to better understand adoption of cover crops and subsurface placement as two of the recommended practices that seem to be pretty promising. I think there's maybe more mixed messages on cover crops out there than there are on subsurface placement, but we'll kind of talk about the perspectives we have on both of those. So like I said, I've been doing this for quite a while. So in 2011, I was part of a team that was funded by the National Science Foundation to build on some kind of pilot work we had done through OSU, through a kind of internal initiative at the university. And this is just kind of a graphic of the approach that our project took. And so again, I'm a decision scientist, but I do most of my work in kind of complex systems, so I do a lot of interdisciplinary work with engineers and physical scientists and ecologists and economists, who I would not call social scientists, so they do things a little bit differently than we do on the behavior side. And so this project was, again, a kind of look at a dynamic, what we would say a coupled human natural system. See if I can, there we go. You've got the human system here, you've got the natural system here, and just like the research we've been seeing for the last day or so is thinking about a field as a system and a farm as a system and a watershed as a system, I would argue that we need to think about policy design as a system and about engagement with farmers as a system, and that it's not just kind of better physical science that answers some of those basic questions, but it's thinking about how that interacts with farmers' motivations, how that interacts with policy design and what policymakers want to see. So the goal of this research, really the big research question, was whether or not we can offset the negative impacts of climate change on Lake Erie through changes in farmer behavior. So as was discussed a little bit yesterday, a lot of what's going on, if farmers are only losing about 1/2 pound of phosphorus per acre, a lot of what's driving these issues is actually weather related, which ties back to these kind of climate trends that we're seeing where we've got bigger spring rains, warmer temperatures in the lake in the summer, and we can't change that. We can't stop the rain in the spring. We can't cool off the lake in the summer. So the only lever we really have is to take what, again, some have argued yesterday are actually pretty good practices by farmers, but make them even better, right? So it's kind of an adaptive management problem where our status quo maybe isn't good enough anymore. And so the way we've thought about this in terms of how we put our project together is that you have to kind of understand what's going on at a policy level, what is the public willing to pay for a cleaner lake, what does that look like so that then there's dollars that can be invested into whether it's direct investments in conservation practices, whether it's investments in kind of partners that are out there doing outreach, and then how do farmers respond to those investments? So when we put those programs out there, what's the likelihood of farmer A versus farmer B actually changing their practices in response to those efforts? We certainly know that even mandatory things aren't necessarily followed, so we can think about kind of mandatory policies, we can think about voluntary policies like cost sharing and whatnot, and try to figure out how farmers are responding to that. And then in our project, we're taking what we kind of learn about farmers at a field level and at an individual level and scaling it up to make better predictions about what's happening across the landscape, so across, in this case, the Maumee watershed. And from there, we have spatial economist and then Jay Martin, engineer at Ohio State, who uses the SWOT model to think about as those changes occur across the landscape in terms of farmer management practices, what happens to those dynamics in terms of nutrient loss, and how do we see that changing? And then ultimately, we have a group of ecologists who then think about, as those loads coming into Lake Erie change, as a response of changes across the upstream system, what happens to the services that the lake provides? Do we see increased clarity? Are there impacts on fisheries? What happens to recreational opportunities? And then ultimately, in a coupled system, you have to think about, as that downstream system changes in response to what's going on up here, does that then change the policy outlook? Does that change kind of public attitudes towards agriculture if people are kind of upset with agriculture? Does it change the way people want to see the problem addressed if the lake gets better or worse? And so then over time, we try to kind of model and link together all these pieces and think about, it's this dynamic system that over time, these things are interacting. And then ultimately, we have this climate piece coming in because, like I said, our big question was, you know, if we can predict how these things interact, we also need to think about how effective those policies might be under different climate conditions, right, as we think into the future. So that's the kind of big goal of the project, just to give you a little background of the type of things I do and how I think about it. And again, my role in it is really focusing on the farmer decision-making piece and asking questions like, can we increase adoption of the right practices? So a lot of you here and a lot of the presenters were thinking about what are the right practices, what actually works, and we're still trying to sort some of that out. But if we figure out what those right practices are, can we actually get anybody to do them? And then I'll talk about what I mean by a fix, but what type of fix will be most effective? Are these things that should be mandated in a regulatory sense? Are these things that should be promoted through voluntary cost share programs? Are these things that we can actually promote just by giving farmers better information about them, right? Which is kind of the ultimate voluntary approach. So I'll talk a little bit about all of those things. But in social science, often there's an individual, Tom Heberlein, who kind of coined this phrase, the three fixes. And so we often think about when we're intervening with human behavior around some sort of an environmental issue or public health issue or agricultural issue, there's kind of three categories of things that you can do, right? So there's the technological fix. And from a behavioral standpoint, the kind of problem with the technological fix is it bypasses, in some ways, the cause of the issue or what's really driving the issue. So if nutrient management practices, the way we're applying, the rates we're applying are part of what's driving the issue, if we just do something like improve our water treatment facilities, then we're kind of putting a Band-Aid on the problem, right? We're fixing maybe the symptoms of the issue, which are issues in the lake that are causing problems for water quality, but we're not going back to the kind of root cause. And again, the root cause for this issue is a combination of changing climatic patterns and human behavior, and we can't really fix the climate thing in the short term. And so again, technological fixes can be really great. They can be a solution to a lot of problems that we have. But again, I usually say use them with caution because you might just be prolonging kind of bigger issues, right? If you don't get back to the root of the issue. The next kind of category of fixes are what we would call structural fixes. And so here you are targeting human behavior, but you're targeting it through changes in the kind of decision-making environment. So changes in the physical environment, the social, the economic environment. So it's really a kind of indirect approach to change behavior. And a perfect example of this, right, for this problem is providing incentives, right, to offset the cost of these conservation practices. A farmer who chooses to enroll in one of those programs doesn't necessarily enroll in that program because he thinks that practice is great. He's willing to try it because you've made it really cheap and easy for him to do in the short term. But if they don't buy into that over time, then they'll stop doing it when the incentives run out, right? And so we can think of other sorts of examples of structural changes, but that's the kind of classic one in agriculture. And then the last is what I call a cognitive fix, but this is your classic communication sort of approach, right? Here you're targeting human behavior again, not so much indirectly, but directly by changing the way people think about the issue, right? Changing the information that you give them so that you can promote more positive attitudes towards a practice, right? Greater belief in the effectiveness of a practice. And by doing that, the hope is that from a voluntary standpoint, you have individuals who are willing to do something different because they think it's important, right? That they've bought into the idea. Not because they're being paid, not because some other sort of external pressure like a regulatory mandate, but because they actually believe it's the right thing to do. And so again, a way that I think about this for this particular problem is better designing our outreach to promote the benefits of a practice. And again, that's what a lot of people have been talking about for the last day, is do these practices work? What are the benefits to the farmer, to kind of collective water quality? And can we better promote that to people so that they understand why this is a good thing to do on their farm? So those are kind of the three categories. So part of what we're trying to do in our project is to think about which of these sorts of approaches is best. And are there some people where one approach works better than the other? And I'll hopefully give you a little bit of insight into what we're thinking along those lines. I do want to point out for people that maybe don't get a lot of exposure to social science and haven't really heard this perspective, that when we talk about a cognitive fix, we're assuming that we've provided people with information that somehow has changed the way they think about the issue. But what we know from decades of research in this area is that cognitive fixes only work when you have a significant group of people kind of here in the middle. So if this is a normal curve, it's a poorly drawn normal curve, but imagine that this is a normal curve. Cognitive fixes are really only effective when you've got kind of a small number of people down here with negative attitudes, doing bad things. You assume that a cognitive fix doesn't work on them. And I can say more about why that is later, but right now let's just assume that we can't change these people. We don't need to change these people, right? These are the ones who already have positive attitudes, already engaging in some of these kind of recommended good practices. And so a cognitive fix only really becomes effective when you've got a big group of people, or a big enough group of people to solve your problem, that are there in the middle where they either haven't developed attitudes towards it, or if they have, they're kind of weakly held, so they're a little bit indifferent, they don't feel too strongly. Those are the only people that you can really target with these sorts of outreach efforts geared towards changing their thinking and have a positive effect. And so I'll show what this kind of map looks like for cover crops and subsurface placement kind of towards the end of the presentation to give you an idea of where people are falling out on this curve, so you can kind of see how much promise is there in a cognitive sort of fix versus other sorts of things that might be available to us. Okay, so what are the right practices? So we've spent a lot of time on this project and then other projects I've gotten involved in the last couple of years with lots of people here actually, of this idea that I make this comment a lot to my partners on these projects that aren't social scientists. I say, well, I can go out there and work really hard to explain with 100% certainty why person A does this and why person B does that. But if I'm not trying to explain the right things, then it's a giant waste of time. So if I can explain how to get 100% of farmers to use filter strips and then someone tells me that's not going to fix the problem, well, then that's not really a good use of my energy. So we've spent a lot of time on this project trying to, and as again you've seen in the last day, trying to figure out what are the right practices. So we don't 100% know yet, but over the course of these projects, we've gotten a better sense. And so it's been a bit of a moving target for us, but currently the way we're thinking about it is kind of in light of this 40% reduction goal that's been put out there. Lots of things have been talked about as a way to achieve that 40% reduction in total phosphorus in the lake. Two that we've decided to focus in a little bit more on in our project. One, because we had some initial data on it from one of our older surveys, and then by the time we did our new survey this last spring as part of a for our project that Laura and Rem and others are involved in, these were the things that seemed the most promising at the time. A few of us were talking earlier that after hearing everyone present for the last day, I'm still pretty convinced that nutrient placement is important, but we're giving real mixed messages on cover crops still, so I think that's an area where we need to think more carefully about how we talk about that, given the farmer audience. So these are the two we've decided to focus on a little bit more. Luckily for us, and Rem's here, so he was a co-author on this project, so if there are questions about this, maybe he can jump in. But luckily for us, we decided to focus on those two things in our last survey, and then this multi-modeling project that I think is still in press. Is it still in press? Is it published yet? Okay. Came out, and this was individuals from a variety of institutions who used the SWOT model to try to think about watershed scale changes in nutrient loading and water quality as it relates to agricultural practices. And so individuals at a variety of institutions, OSU, Heidelberg, Michigan, Texas, I'm trying to remember who else, all use their version of a validated, calibrated SWOT model to test a variety of scenarios to start to get at this question of the 40% reduction, right? And to start to think about, can we actually get to that level and what does it take using these watershed scale models as a way of thinking about hypothetical changes in practices. So just to point out a few things, the red dashed line is that target, that 40% reduction goal. Up here in the blue, you can see actual data, so it kind of shows where we are right now and what it would take to get down there. Here's a scenario where they actually turned off the point sources, and so it's just an example to show that even turning off all of the point sources isn't actually going to get us there. These kind of scenarios in the pink are pretty big conversions of cropland to grassland, 10 to 50%. Again, not something we're probably likely to do in agriculture, but again, just a way to kind of think about what sort of an impact would that have on phosphorus loading, and if you can convert half of our agricultural land to grass, you can get there, right? But It's never going to happen. So just to kind of give you a sense of those sorts of things. Now here in the gray, you see a variety of kind of in-field practices, best management practices that they've combined in different ways, spread to different levels across the landscape to see, as we place these practices out there, what sort of an impact might it have. And what I'll highlight is there's really just one kind of scenario that shows some promise, where you're getting below that target line for total phosphorus and dissolved reactive phosphorus. You do a little bit better. Yeah. When you randomly place these practices across the landscape, you don't do quite as well as when you target them to kind of high-risk areas, so you see a little bit of a difference there. But in general, this is the kind of magic scenario from the things that they considered and ran through the models that seems to work. And I'm actually working with the OSU group to think a little more carefully about other scenarios we can run, because I'll talk about why I think these maybe aren't the best combination of things from a behavioral standpoint, but at least gives us a starting point of what's out there that seems to work. The practices that were included in this scenario were subsurface application of phosphorus at about a 50% adoption level across the landscape, cereal rye cover crop in the winter without wheat at about a 58% adoption across the landscape, and then filter strips, application of medium quality buffer strips at 78% adoption, so that's a pretty big number. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, where were those percentages? How do they?
Yeah, so correct me if I'm wrong, Rem, but so for instance, subsurface application beyond 50% of the agricultural landscape that's having fertilizer applied, correct? Yeah, same thing with cover crops. It's that level, that proportion of land across the landscape that is currently in production that could be using that practice. And then filter strips is a little harder for me to understand, but in the SWAT model, is that of the fields that should have a, or does that get hard to explain?
Sub-basin level.
At the sub-basin level, okay.
So that's the only way SWAT can do it.
Yeah, so that one's a little tricky. Luckily, I haven't really focused on filter strips. When we started this project, like I said, the targets have been moving a lot in terms of what should farmers be doing and what should we focus on. But early on, because of our focus on dissolved reactive phosphorus, we decided not to really dig into filter strips in our survey, since that's more of a particulate phosphorus mitigation strategy. So when you're talking about total P, obviously that's probably why it shows up here, because it's important for that. But it's not as important probably for dissolved reactive phosphorus. So we focus more on those kind of in-field practices that can help to retain dissolved phosphorus. So yeah, I have some questions about this. I've, in talking with the SWAT modelers, said that I think that's really unrealistic from a behavioral standpoint, and also very expensive from a policy standpoint. So one of the things we've talked about based on some of our data is running some scenarios where maybe we reduce the filter strip adoption level, but we increase subsurface and we kind of play around with the cover crop one, maybe target it to different areas. I think there's some combinations of these things that are still really promising from a behavioral and policy standpoint, but I think as they're laid out here just from a physical modeling sense, they're maybe not completely realistic. So I can talk about that some more.
Well, your I guess negativity of being able to achieve the filter strips, I say would be wrong, because if we approach that as that property that they did that to came off of the property tax roll,
Yep.
and you'd have a higher adoption,
Yeah.
then they're not paying for something they can get no income from.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, I don't mean to be overly negative about it. I think there's potential for all of these things. Again, we haven't focused as much on the filter strips. I don't have a lot of empirical data to really even say what the likelihood is. But we do know from some choice experiments that our economists did early on in our very first survey, which was back in like 2011, that it can get pretty expensive. So you do have to think about the right kind of presentation of that, the right conditions, what are other things that are going on kind of structurally in the policy environment or in the market that we could actually, play on. So I think there's possibility there. But when I first saw this, I was like, ooh, that's a pretty high number. And I think some of these things maybe could be an easier sell given what kind of current conditions are. But yeah, it's a kind of open question.
So a series of practices, they're targeted on 50%. You said that didn't get as good of,
No,
that's a higher return, correct?
higher return. Targeted is better, a little bit better. Yeah. So if you take, and so the 50% is misleading because the scenario calls it 50%, but these are the actual numbers across the specific practices. But the idea is that, yes, if we randomly scatter these adoption levels across versus target them to high-risk fields, that would be high slope, based on soil type slope, things like that. that you see a little better return. So you do see a better return. It's not quite as good for dissolved reactive phosphorus, but you see a little better return.
It gets us into 50%.
Yeah, it still gets,
At
yeah.
the time to achieve our level, and that's what we're looking for.
Right.
Well, then, my next big question would be, since you understand the human mind so well, what do we do about the 25% you can't move?
Nothing, but I'll get to that. So I'm gonna try to answer that question. Yeah, you should be one of them. No, I mean, what I'm gonna get to is this. What I'm gonna get to is that these numbers don't require everybody to do it. So I think that's an important kind of takeaway from this, is sometimes we go into these sorts of things thinking we've got to get everybody to do this. Well, there's a lot of ways to think about it. One, not everybody has to do it to get to that target goal. Two, not everybody has to do it right now. I think there's a lot of evidence from behavioral literature that people will eventually buy in, but you can't get everybody to do it in the next year to 5 years, right? There's these cultural shifts that take a long time. And so we would say, back to that kind of normal curve I showed you, that if you've got some percentage of people down there in this, like, this sounds like a horrible idea category, that we don't want to do anything about them right now. And kind of spoiler alert, there's only about 15% of them for these two practices. So it's not a big chunk of people. But I would say don't worry about them right now. And there's a couple of reasons why. One is a lot of them tend to be older. And so I've used the term they will probably age out of the farming population relatively soon. And when we see the kind of younger people coming in, they tend to have different philosophies on average. So we might see a natural kind of shift as the generational kind of transfer happens. We also know, again, from kind of behavioral theory and innovation theory in agriculture, that eventually these kind of new innovations, technologies, practices become the norm and people buy in, and those are the last people to buy in. So by kind of natural evolution of adoption, they will eventually do it, but they're not the people you want to target up front. Yeah, Jeff.
Robert, are you going to comment at all about maintaining this long term? One of the questions we're always asked on Annex 4 is, how can we guarantee that our success, if we're successful, is going to be long term? So if you get people to make these changes, what do you have to do to keep them in?
Yeah, so I will talk about that a little bit. I guess to answer that kind of quickly, we have to get those cognitive changes. So you have to get that buy-in at an individual level, and you can't just allow the kind of structural forces to be the way that you get kind of sustainable solutions, right? Because there's a lot of evidence that when you take incentives away, for instance, unless people have bought into that practice while using it with the cost-sharing option, they'll drop it, right? And I have a cover crop project where we're doing a lot of in-depth interviews with farmers, and a lot of the current adopters are like, well, I've done it for 3 years, but now that the cost sharing is going away, the profit margins are too small, and I'm not going to keep doing it because I don't see the benefit of it. So I think it really is demonstrating those benefits and getting that buy-in at an individual level, and not relying purely on these kind of outside forces to get people on board. Other questions?
At this point, you're targeting the individual fields as opposed to small watersheds, because a lot of the programs seem to be picking up the small watershed, and this is where we're going to focus our effort. And when you do that, you end up not really targeting necessarily the worst case in a larger area.
Yeah, so the current things, and my very last slide kind of shows where we're going with this, is we're trying to think about this a little more spatially and see where those overlaps are. So I'm looking at it at a field level because we're asking really detailed questions of farmers about what they're doing on a kind of representative field. So that's the only way we can kind of capture things at the behavioral level, but we can aggregate and scale that up, right? So we can look at that at a watershed level, or we could look at the interactions of kind of the placement of those fields at some larger scale, whether it's sub-basin, whether it's the full. So we have a lot of flexibility. We're looking at it at the kind of smallest scale we can, but we have techniques where we can kind of aggregate that up too. If a program wants to target, say, a different kind of geographic boundary and wants some insight into what's going on within that. Yeah.
Yeah. Subsurface application of pea fertilizer is 50%. When you're looking at that, are you assuming that no one's doing any subsurface application, or
So
you know how much subsurface
good question.
application there is and you need 50% more?
you don't need 50% more. So this is 50% total across the landscape. So this is not accounting for the fact that some people are already doing it. So you don't need, to get to that 50%, we don't need 50% more. And I have some data that'll show what that probably increase is, and it's probably more, well, I would say probably 20% more. I think some of our numbers show that it's at about a 30% adoption rate right now, so we might need about 20% more. And again, Rem, jump in if I'm misrepresenting your research at all.
Yeah, that's correct. If you just
That
We put
varies so much
50% there.
amongst areas. How can you, I mean,
Well, yeah, and these models are not, again, they are accounting for targeting two areas that they've identified as high risk in the model, so they have looked at both of those, but you're right, it's gonna vary, and that's where some of our data comes in, is we can kind of show where adoption rates are higher, where they're lower, how that might overlap with what we call physical hotspots or areas that we might wanna focus on. And I have a comparison of two maps to kind of show you, it's a first step at a paper I'm working on, but that tries to get at that exact question. Like, are there areas where adoption of these things is really low and it's a high-risk area, and maybe that's where we should be putting our energy, whether that's figuring out what the county boundary is there, whether if that's a sub-basin sort of boundary and we want to target programs there. I mean, there's a lot of ways we can think about it, but that's part of our goal of this coupled systems approach, is exactly that, right? To start to link these things together and have a more kind of spatially specific approach to how we're investing in these sorts of things.
Probably I can explain more what the 50% targeted means. I mean, we identify the areas that has low yield and at the same time higher exports of nutrients, and those are the targeted areas. So when we say 50%, I mean, there are some areas that are doing some BMPs on the fields already, and we just expand the whole thing, include them in the 50% reduction. So it would be not really the 50% added to that, added to the targeted, but just the 50% across the whole area, with some of that already doing some of the BMPs.
Yeah, yeah, and so that's again where some of our data, and I know some folks are using some of our survey data to start with different baselines and SWOT, so trying to actually better account for what's currently happening and then what would the actual increase have to be, but this isn't taking into account current adoption levels, it's just saying if there was nothing, we would need to get a 50% level. Yeah, but we're already well on our way to some of these, so it's not maybe as bad as it looks. I actually have no idea what the filter strip adoption levels are. Does anyone have any idea? Like what % of the landscape might, I don't know. That one I don't actually know.
that varies on county to county.
Yeah.
But some areas are much more sensitive and you see grass waterways a lot. Some
Yeah.
of them you don't
Yeah.
see any.
Yeah.
We have great discussions about filter strips in the modeling group, because based on from Kevin's data, actually more than 50% or almost 80% of the flow goes through the tiles. So there's the question about filter strips actually.
Yeah.
So there's not a discussion about
Yeah. And is there is there a report or something available on this study yet that people could access if they want to see the details?
The University of Michigan Water Center released a particular report for this.
Okay.
And the paper actually is right now the final.
Should be coming out soon, but yeah. So yeah, if you Google University of Michigan Water Center, you can get at least a summary of some of these findings, and then the paper should be out soon. So it gives you a little more detail on some of these kinds of things, like what's actually producing those numbers, what is the SWOT model assuming in order to get to these levels. But again, for me, from a behavioral standpoint, it gives us at least an initial idea of some sort of combination of things at some level that might work. And then the question is, what type of fix would be most effective to get to those levels, right? So if we're trying to get to those different levels on these practices, whether or not at the end of the day that's the final set of things at the final set of levels, that maybe remains to be seen. But what type of fix will work? So again, we've been doing pretty extensive survey research at a variety of scales. So back in 2011, we did just the Ohio counties and the Maumee as part of a pilot project funded by OSU. In 2014, we did a survey of the full Maumee watershed, all 3 states, funded by National Science Foundation. And then this last year, we did the entire Western Lake Erie Basin, funded by our 4R project with IPNI. So there are descriptive reports of all of these results online. I have the websites at the end of the presentation. So if you're interested in looking up what farmers said, what sorts of data we collected, that's all publicly available, and you can look at that. Our response rate has been ranged from 35 to 43%, which is actually probably really good for survey research. Obviously, this is a little reflective of the fact that this is an issue that's important to the population that we're studying, and so often with general public surveys, you may only get a 10 to 15% response rate. So we're pretty happy with it. We have looked at non-response bias, and we're pretty, again, satisfied with who responded, and we're not too worried about a bias in our sample. Again, the goals of these surveys really was to, one, think about what are the baseline adoption levels of some of these recommended practices, and then can we model the likely adoption of these as a result of kind of future policy changes or changes in our outreach programs. So just a little background on who responded. The average age of our respondent was 57 years old. About 55% have received some college education. Farm size, the medians were 300 owned, 500 rented acres. And then you can see the kind of breakdowns by category. This is all for our most recent survey, so the one we conducted in the full Western Basin this last winter. And we specifically excluded farms under 50 acres simply because they're something like 50% of the farming population in the basin, but they only farm 2 to 3% of the landscape. And so we didn't want a big bias in our sample. If we did a representative sample of farmers, we would have a big bias towards kind of smaller farms and a much smaller portion of the landscape. So we excluded those and only sampled from farms above that size. So we actually our survey data is more representative of the way the landscape is managed, less representative of the farming population, if that makes sense. Because then we also stratified it to make sure that we got a good sample of the bigger farms, since they're, again, farming a larger proportion of the acreage. And this is just a breakdown of the tillage practices across the sample, just to give you an idea of some of the other sorts of things. So what do they think? So we asked a lot of questions about water quality and what they're concerned about, and how effective they think different practices are. And it's a good story. I think it's reflective of everything else we've been hearing here, that farmers are doing a good job for the most part, right? And maybe some of the flaws are the recommendations that they're getting, and we need to do a better job with some of that. 77% think they have a good understanding of the 4 R's of nutrient stewardship. 82% agree that they think about nutrient stewardship, both as it relates to water quality and profit on their farm. 56% have changed practices in the past 3 years. That's actually a similar number to what Greg showed yesterday, of people who said they would change in the future after going through the training program. 54% are concerned about their farms contributing to algal blooms in Lake Erie, but as you might expect, bigger numbers are concerned about other things, right? So 77% are concerned about the impact of nutrient loss to their profit. And 88%, the biggest thing by far people were concerned about, was additional regulation and being kind of forced to do things in a way that they may not want to. So that's just the kind of snapshot of some of the kind of attitudes and beliefs that were out there. And then this is just a table, so this kind of gets back to some of the questions earlier. These are some of the things we've been tracking over time. This was our 2011 survey, 2014. This says 2017 because these are the numbers representing when we asked people in the survey last year, what are your plans for the next season? So that's why that looks kind of funny. But basically what it's showing is we're seeing kind of an increasing adoption trend for a lot of these things since 2011. Again, these are the people who said that they were planning to do it in the upcoming year, and so we can now kind of look at that and see if we've actually gotten close to that level. Avoiding winter application, delaying, this is storm-based kind of delay, so paying attention to weather patterns, subsurface placement, rates based on testing. And so what I want to highlight here, so again, these are the kind of people who said, yeah, in the next year I plan to do this. Again, this is on a given field, so they're reporting on kind of an average representative field on the farm. This does not represent at a farm scale what they're doing. We've actually tried to kind of capture that in the surveys, and the data is not very reliable, so we haven't been able to do that. Yeah.
Can you define subsurface placement?
Yeah, so the way we asked it was placing the fertilizer at least 2 to 3 inches below the soil. And we had a separate question about broadcast with incorporation, so it doesn't include that.
Does that tease out like starter fertilizer? I mean, is it in terms of a full nutrient application versus just a small amount of it?
We can tease that out. So this is based on the more kind of general measure of kind of have you used this in the past? What are your plans in the future for this particular field? We do then for that field have really detailed data on the management of it, so we could probably look at that, but this doesn't account for those differences. So what I want to highlight here, and kind of, again, getting back to what's the potential of actually getting to these adoption levels and actually solving the problem, the need, as identified by that multi-modeling effort, is about 58% for cover crops, 50% for subsurface placement. What I have here in this column that I call the potential future is the 2017 self-reported behavior. So this is the data from farmers who say, I plan to do this next year on this particular field, plus those reporting likely adoption. So then for those who said, no, I'm not going to do it next year, but I'll probably do it in the future, people who show some sort of kind of motivational interest in it at some level, those numbers exceed, barely in this case, but by quite a bit in this case, those target levels. So just from a purely kind of motivational standpoint, if we just target those people who are already doing it, who show some pretty strong interest in doing it, we find the right kind of mechanisms to motivate them and to make it easier for them to do, we can probably reach those levels without having to deal with the well, in the adoption literature, right, the laggards, right, without having to deal with maybe the individuals who really are opposed or really not interested in something. And so I think that's good news, because again, my biggest concern from a behavioral standpoint is if you have a lot of really unwilling folks, it's going to be really hard. You can't even pay them enough to do things sometimes, right? So we have to have a pretty motivated and willing audience, and I think that we do. And I'll kind of break those numbers down a little more for you so you can see what that looks like. So part of what we wanted to do then is thinking about just these two practices as our initial kind of case study. We wanted to model the adoption of those practices and try to start to tease out what are the things that really make a difference for the adopters versus the non-adopters, and within that kind of non-adoption category, what we might call the laggards versus the future adopters, right? And often in kind of outreach and extension, the focus is on those future adopters. I mean, it's typically what you're doing anyways, is kind of trying to motivate that kind of next wave of people. And so what you see here is just the results of a logistic regression where the comparison category are the laggards, so the people who essentially said, I'll never do this. So this is the category of people who show really no interest. So what these numbers are showing you is what's the probability of an individual being an innovator versus a laggard given these sorts of factors. What's the probability of an individual being a future adopter versus a laggard given these factors. And so what you see is there's no really effect of age in explaining why someone falls into one of those three categories. We do see an effect of farm income on future adopters versus laggards and subsurface placement, and that category is the $100,000 to $250,000 category. So if you're in that category, you're much more likely to be a future adopter than a laggard. That's basically what that's saying, 70% more likely. We do see a negative effect of high school education when you compare innovators to laggards. If you only have a high school education, you're much more likely to be a laggard versus an innovator. So there's some kind of positive effect of education on the innovators, which again is kind of consistent with what we know from adoption literature. We see a negative effect of conventional tillage on innovation for cover crops, which makes sense because we should see that paired, the recommendation often to pair that with no-till. And then what I really want to point out is the one thing, and this is true for a lot of other things we've looked at, storm-based or storm delay application, seasonal kind of timing of application, that the perceived efficacy of that practice has the biggest positive effect across all of these categories. So you are, and by that I mean, can I put this practice on my field, on my farm, and will it work if I do it? Will I actually see those nutrient loss reductions? Will I see a decrease in inputs? Will I see an improvement in water quality? So we're collectively measuring different dimensions of those sorts of beliefs that say, like, yeah, I can do this and it'll actually solve the problem. However we define the problem, at a field or farm scale or at a watershed scale. And so what we see is this is the only thing that significantly predicts what category you're going to fall into across these practices. So innovators, you're 80% more likely and 59% more likely for subsurface to be an innovator compared to a laggard as these increases in efficacy happen. The numbers are a little smaller for future adopters, but again, if you have stronger beliefs that these things will actually work, you have a greater probability of being a future adopter versus a laggard as well. And it kind of makes sense the numbers are higher here because you would hope once somebody starts doing it, they start to buy in even more to the idea that it works. You would expect those levels of efficacy to go up even higher. But we do see a tendency for those who are like, yeah, I might do it in the future, to already have bought in a little bit more to the idea. And then we don't see any kind of big barriers for subsurface placement, which is, again, good from a behavioral standpoint. There doesn't seem to be a big effect of kind of like cost concerns or other sorts of things, which I was a little surprised by. But we see big barriers for cover crops. And the sorts of things we asked were concerns about establishing the cover crop in the fall, concerns about it interfering with spring planting, concerns about the upfront cost given the uncertain long-term benefit. And those things are really critical. So they have a negative impact on innovation and future adoption. So basically you see that as concern about those barriers go up, you're much more likely to be a laggard. You're much more likely to be in that category of people who's like, yeah, I'm probably never going to do this. So just to give you an idea, so as a behavioral scientist, these are the sorts of things I tend to focus on, or what are these beliefs that are really critical? How can we kind of motivate people by leveraging those sorts of beliefs? And so going back again to this idea, if we were going to kind of target efficacy and try to build farmers' belief in the practices as an effective tool to solve whichever kind of scale of problem we're talking about, that's only going to work if we have a decent number of people here in the middle, right, that we can actually target and shift in some way. And so when we look at cover crop adoption, there's about 14% of our farmers who quite literally say, I'll never do this. So that's not bad, actually. That's kind of a good thing. And they're people who, again, Not only is the age factor sometimes coming into play there, but we also sometimes see for some practices a negative effect of rented acreage, which again makes a lot of sense because you're going to invest in a field or you're going to invest in land and make these changes that are long-term. You want to make sure you're still farming that field in the long term. So there might be a mechanism for thinking about how those sorts of agreements are made. But we see actually about 60% of the farmers fall into this future adopter category, and I'll break this down a little bit more. They range in their kind of level of motivation as a future adopter, from the really motivated ones to the more hesitant ones. So I'll kind of break that down. And then 20% are kind of currently falling into the, yeah, I plan to do this actually next year. So then what we wanted to do is, so we've got some evidence that there's a big group of people here in the middle. That's a good sign that we might actually be able to engage them. So then what we did is we actually ran the predicted probabilities of adoption given different increases in efficacy. So absent experimental data, which actually, where's Beth? Beth's going to help me with that. Absence experimental data where we're actually trying different techniques for building efficacy and seeing if that actually has a causal kind of positive effect on adoption. We can at least model if we increased efficacy by a certain percent, what would that do to the number of people in these categories. So what you see here is this is the predicted probability of adoption. Here's our baseline levels. So here's our future adopters. They're almost 60%, right? Here's our laggards. And here's our innovators. So this is where we currently are in terms of the spread of the population. If you increase efficacy by 10%, you can start to see how those trends shift. What I want to point out is to get to our 58% adoption level, which is about here. It looks funny from this angle, but I think that's right. We actually have to increase efficacy by 90%. So it's a really big increase. And what you can see is you don't even start to have a positive effect on that until you get to 85%. So even increasing efficacy by 10, 20, 30, 40 does nothing really to our future adopters. They're just hanging out there in the land of, yeah, maybe in the future, which makes a lot of sense because cover crops, there's a lot of risk and uncertainty. It's not this discrete choice where you just say, I'm going to do it and it works and now I'm done. There's a lot of management involved in it. And so there's clearly some kind of skepticism, I would say, around cover crops. And our ability to really push that curve forward is going to be a little more challenging just by promoting efficacy, right? Just by kind of building beliefs. But like I said, every time I go to a conference like this, I hear very mixed messages on cover crops. So I'm not real shocked that this is the case either, because I don't think there's a clear message out there on when they work, how they work, with what goals, and in what way do you use them. And so it's, again, maybe not surprising that we see this. Yeah, okay. And so then for subsurface placement, similar sort of trend. We have a small group of the nevers, a pretty decent group here. And when we look at this predicted probability, it's a better story because if we want to get to that 50% adoption level, we only need to increase efficacy by about 45%. And you see a much more rapid shift in those curves as you're increasing efficacy. So this is not as hard of a sell based on the behavioral data that we have, which again is a good sign. This is just showing what those mean changes look like, but we don't need to worry about that. So to get to those questions and wrap up here, I would argue for a kind of targeted fix, right? So similar to, I think Kevin yesterday said there's no silver bullet. I don't think there's a silver bullet on the policy and kind of outreach side either. I would argue that we don't worry about this 14 to 18%. We can't probably change them. We may not be able to pay them enough to do things, but if we don't change them, I don't think it hurts our ability to get to that 40% reduction. If we break those future adopters down, we have a pretty even split of kind of hesitant adopters who are like they say I'm unlikely to do it, but I might, versus the motivated folks who are much more likely to do it. And so these kind of structural solutions where we're offsetting the costs, where we're trying to kind of motivate people through external sorts of mechanisms is going to be more useful and more helpful for that kind of hesitant group. Whereas for the motivated folks, I would argue that we could really focus on these cognitive solutions and we could give better recommendations and more kind of hands-on experience that's tailored to different farm types, to even some of what Steve was saying before, where we actually could probably shift these people just by promoting the benefits of the practices in really helpful, visual, hands-on sorts of ways, and being more consistent in our messaging about that too. And most importantly, I would again point out that if you just combine the innovators with those motivated future adopters, you get to those target levels that the multi-modeling effort pointed out. So I don't think it's a hard sell. I don't think it's a stretch to get there. And I think there's lots of tools in the toolbox to do that. Like I was saying, our next plan is to start to kind of spatially overlay this. So this is adoption levels kind of mapped by county, This is from the OSU version of the SWAP model, delivery of DRP by subbasin. So you could then think about, like, this is a low-risk area for DRP, but there's low adoption levels there. This is how many people said they aren't currently using either of these practices. But we might still call that low risk because we may not be worried about these people changing, given that this is a low-risk area in a physical sense. Whereas we might want to target, I don't know where that is exactly, someone might know, these areas where we see both kind of high physical risk in terms of the landscape and really low adoption levels of the practices, right? So we might be more efficient if we kind of start to think about how these things overlap and how we could target funds or investments into those specific areas. That's it. I won't go through that. Here's the websites if you want to access any of the reports, which again go through kind of great detail, all of the results from the survey, and you can always email me too with questions. Ask questions, it's fine. Okay.
The kind of risk management, those kind of last two maps you published.
No, so that's what we're working on right now. So the postdoc on this NSF project that works with the SWAP model and I are putting our heads together and trying to figure out how to do this. So the idea is to think about kind of physical and social hotspots and start to think about how they overlap and then run different scenarios where we target in different ways and see if the outcomes, if we can get to that targeted 40% reduction more quickly or more efficiently. So we're working on it. Yeah.
Two comments about the filter strips buffers. Due to the fact that this area is typically flat and they have the tile ground system, farming here is not in the three-dimensional, so it's actually two-dimensional. It's going to be just 1 meter by 1 meter is actually 1 dimension. So whatever you do, you have to do the source to increase, so otherwise it's going to show up in tile. Number two, I think one of the biggest important, I guess you have one of the interesting scenario here is that incorporating or injecting the fertilizer into the ground. If you show along with it, we're trying to do that in NCT, which economics is going to come next. If they're increasing yield, economically is going to make money for farmers. That's where they're going to jump into 50% higher because they need to know the pocket how to improve their life.
Yeah, and I imagine that's part of why we see better trends on the efficacy side there, because the whole point of efficacy is, again, will it achieve my goals? And a lot of the farmers' goals are driven by profit, right? It's not just water quality and that sort of thing. So it's, again, less of a hard sell to convince them that using subsurface placement is going to solve some of those issues for them. So it makes sense. Yeah.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I heard you say it many times, that consistency of message.
Yeah.
And I think if anything that us on this side can do is either agree on, figure out what we do agree on, and figure out what we don't agree on, and find solutions to why we don't agree.
Yep.
If the data are mixed out there, you know, if cover crops are a solution, find out how to make them a positive solution rather than a loss or whatever. So I think that's on us to do that so that farmers hear that consistent message. And then also you talk about the innovators. I think they can be huge proponents to getting those folks in the, I'm thinking about it, say, hey, this works on my farm. This is how I made it work on my farm. No matter what any research might say, I made it work on my farm, and I can help you make it successful too. We just need to use those mechanisms to get these folks.
Yeah, I would totally agree with just everything you said, so you're not putting words in my mouth. The communication research would say you should have 3 messages that are repeated over and over and over again, and people have to hear them multiple times to get on board with it. So sometimes we make it overly complicated, and so thinking about what those key messages are and how that can be delivered multiple times through multiple ways. And then Jim and I were talking, and Beth and I were talking last night about this project we have where one of the biggest things that non-adopters for the cover crops say is a barrier is that when they go to field days and they go see kind of trials in other farms, they don't feel like they can translate what they learned to their farm because their farm's unique, right? Or my field's unique. And so we maybe need to do a better job with representative examples that cover a diversity of sorts of systems and soils. And because a lot of farmers are having a hard time going to those events and then saying, oh yeah, I can go successfully do this on my farm because there's too many things that are different about this guy's field or this guy's farm.
But one of the reasons the laggards might not be doing it is because of the equipment change, like injecting the phosphorus. They're all big farmers are geared up, but they're in hired, they got great big equipment, costs thousands and thousands of dollars to change, and they're probably not going to do it.
Yeah, and if you're an older farmer and you see kind of an end to your career, you're certainly not going to invest in really big things like that. And we see some sort of an effect of that. Probably would like to move on to your next, yeah, okay, thanks.
Thank you, Robyn.
I think Robyn gave us